This evening's discussion will be facilitated in multiple parts. You'll first hear from administration representatives, followed by two brief panel discussions. The first panel will feature community activists and leaders intimately involved in pushing their communities forward. Next, you will hear from a group of law enforcement officials working to keep their communities safe and protected. Following these two discussions, we will segue into a question and answer period with the governor, members of his cabinet, and several other community leaders and government officials. As always, we do want to be respectful of your time this evening and recognizing that this discussion is taking place during the dinner and family hour, so let's go ahead and get started. The title of tonight's discussion is centered on racial equity and police reform, two topics intrinsically linked together. Much has been said in recent weeks about efforts to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we recognize the importance of ensuring these efforts are linked. The title of this discussion is intentional in that we recognize that racial equity in many ways is about the application of justice. In centering this discussion, we wanted to open things up with Brian Moran, the Virginia Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security. Secretary Moran has served in this role for the past two administrations, and during his leadership, Virginia has seen one of the lowest recidivism rates in the country for multiple years running. In addition to this, the practice of suspending driver's licenses for non-related driving offenses, including drug offenses, ended, and Virginia's juvenile population significantly reduced. These efforts are just a few of some of the strides that we've made over the past 2 years. And again, these efforts are great, but we recognize that there is more to be done to move closer toward equity and justice. Secretary Moran, welcome.
Tracy, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I really look forward to tonight's conversation. Also, special thanks and recognition to Dr. Janice Underwood for helping organize this evening's town hall. So look forward to the evening. You mentioned storms, so I do want to recognize, of course, here we are just turning the lights back on for some folks after the recent tropical storm, and we're having some stormy weather in parts of the Commonwealth now. And just want to give a shout out to those first responders and emergency managers who were working these storms day in and day out. And as Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security, it really has been one of my true honors and pleasures to be able to work with our public safety officials throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I thank them and recognize them for all their hard work and dedication to the safety of our fellow Virginians. So I do look forward to tonight's conversation with community members and law enforcement officials. Clearly, these are very important issues and timely ones. And so, again, I thank you all for organizing this, and thank you all for joining us, and certainly the panel members for participating. As many of you know, Governor Northam has called the General Assembly back for special session August 18th. Just in a couple of weeks, we'll be dealing with these very issues I suspect we'll talk about tonight. So we're in the process of developing a very robust what is going on in the Commonwealth and this country. So we look forward to that, and we will have those ready for our special session. And I'll say, though, that they will complement much of what has already been done by the Northam administration. You know, we have done a tremendous amount of work to reform our criminal justice system and invest in policies that promote equity. This past January, Governor Northam proposed and the legislature passed a number of bills that will impact literally hundreds of thousands of our fellow Virginians. In addition to historic gun violence prevention legislation, which I'm very pleased to say is already working, we also championed several pieces of criminal justice reform. For example, we ended the practice of suspending driver's licenses for non-driving related offenses, and for the inability for those who were unable to pay their court fines and costs. So we no longer suspend licenses, which are vitally important for people to get to work and provide for their families. We also expanded access to parole for individuals who were juveniles at the time of the offense and individuals impacted by Fishback versus Commonwealth, where juries were not informed that parole had been abolished. Additionally, we decriminalized marijuana and are in the process of studying legalization. During Governor Northam's administration, he raised the felony larceny threshold from $200 to $1,000. That's a 400% increase. Governor Northam has also committed to opposing legislation that creates or expands mandatory minimum sentences. It has actually vetoed legislation from both Democrats and Republicans which would have done so. But we have more work to do. We realize that, we recognize that, and we're working to do that. We need to look at ways to reduce contacts with law enforcement that lead to arrests and instead increase interactions that will build trust in the system and in our law enforcement agencies so that we may ultimately achieve a long-lasting public safety for everyone. Our Department of Criminal Justice Services is developing a long-term community engagement plan right now that is intended to identify strategies and opportunities to rebuild community and police relationships. I am grateful to Governor Northam for his leadership in this area, and I know we will be able to move forward together. Now I would like to introduce to you all Virginia's 73rd Governor of the Commonwealth, Ralph Northam.
Well, good evening to everyone, and thank you, Secretary Moran, for your kind introduction and also for your leadership and tremendous work. I'm really pleased to be here with all of you. I'm sorry that we can't be in person. We're joined tonight by hundreds of Virginians who are interested in hearing from community members and law enforcement officials about racial equity and policing reform. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join this important conversation, especially as was said during the dinner hour. I hope that you and your families are staying safe and healthy. I know there is a lot of anger, pain, and outrage about the wrongful murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others. In the past several weeks, I have spoken with community members across our Commonwealth, and I've met with law enforcement officials. Recent events have shattered the already fractured trust between law enforcement and the community and have really demonstrated the need to take a hard look at law enforcement policies, practices, and actions. So we must understand the ways in which racism has been built into our existing systems in order to root out the inequalities in our criminal justice system, healthcare system, education system, financial and housing systems, and so many others. We must foster collaboration between law enforcement agencies and the communities that they serve, including Black and brown people, for a meaningful and sustained change in police culture and to achieve true public safety. So our administration is dedicated to listening to diverse voices throughout our Commonwealth. We continue to work to address systemic inequality through administrative and legislative changes. As you know, and as Brian said, I have called a special session of the Virginia General Assembly for August 18th, and the legislature has already begun holding committee hearings regarding racial equity and police reform. And so I look forward to working with legislators and community stakeholders like yourselves to pass legislation which would create a better, safer, and more equitable Commonwealth for all Virginians. So tonight, you will hear from community leaders and organizers as well as law enforcement officials, and I hope you find the conversation helpful and engaging. I have designated this week as Virginia's first Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week. So it is a particularly good time to have this town hall meeting. Virginians all have an important role to play in improving racial justice and equity in our communities, our schools, our law enforcement agencies, and our society. So I want to turn this over to our Chief Diversity Officer, but just to reiterate, this is not a political issue. It's not Republican versus Democrat. It's about equity. It's about police reform. It's about making sure that Virginians feel safe, make sure that they feel respected. And we're all in this together. So I just encourage all of you, and I thank you for taking time to be on this call tonight. And, you know, I've learned so much during my administration. I like to listen, and I tell people the more I know, the more I can do. And that's true of our administration as well. So it's time to turn words into action. Virginians are depending on us to make things better. And I'm committed, our administration is committed, and I really thank all of you for being here tonight. And being here tonight just assures us that you are committed as well. So on behalf of Virginia, I say thank you. And I also remind you to keep yourself safe and healthy as well as your families. We're going to get through this together. So Janice Underwood, Dr. Janice Underwood is our DEI officer. The first state, Virginia is, to have this particular position. We want to make her a part of our cabinet. We'll take care of that during the next legislative session. But she's done amazing work here in the Commonwealth, just being here less than a year, and wonderful things are happening. So, Dr. Underwood, thank you for your service to your staff, to all of the rest of our staff that are on this call tonight, and I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, Janice.
Thank you, Governor Northam. Given the recent charge to come together by the late Congressman John Lewis in his final words printed in the New York Times, I am so glad to see so many Virginians have done exactly that tonight for this important discussion to share our diverse personal experiences and generate solutions for racial equity and police reform ahead of the special session on August 18th. It is so great to see so many of you all logging on tonight. As I recently read Congressman Lewis's last op-ed, the words, quote, "ordinary people with extraordinary vision" resonated with me most because I believe that best describes us in the Commonwealth and our capacity to make our state a more just and inclusive place to live and work and learn and thrive. So in my mind, tonight's event is a genuine coming together of community members and public safety officials for a robust discussion about both racial equity generally and police reform specifically. Now, for those of you who are wondering, why are we talking about racial equity and not a more inclusive range of diversity dimensions? And I offer this response. Race and the system of race, otherwise known as structural racism, were and are foundational to every other form of bias and othering. It is ingrained into all of our systems and everything we do, so much so that it is endemic. So in the spirit of the Commonwealth's first annual Racial Truth and Reconciliation Week, like the governor mentioned, and might I add, today's date is the anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act. It is my hope that we can together become one Virginia, united towards justice for all. Now, we've done some incredible and tangible things that Secretary Moran and Governor Northam just mentioned in the past year, and that is evidenced by the many equity and historic justice laws that took effect as of July 1, just a few weeks ago. But we know we are just at the beginning and there's so much more to do. Therefore, that's why this important discussion is only one of many. And going forward, we are planning several smaller scale community conversations in partnership with local officials and community members just like you that will turn into actionable reform in the regular January 2021 session. So a special thank you to everyone who is taking time to be a part of this dialogue. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. Thank you to those who sent in questions, and a hearty thank you to the Planning Committee from the Offices of Public Safety and Homeland Security and the Secretary of the Commonwealth. And in particular, I'd like to thank Ms. Alacia Hackett, who has been instrumental in the planning of so many of these town hall events for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Tonight, we will hear best practices among many different stakeholders and answer many of your questions. Thank you also to those who submitted suggestions for racial equity and police reform for the Northam administration to consider. Lastly, if you're interested in learning more about some of the initiatives in the Governor's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, this brand new cabinet area, I invite you to our website, which will be very easily accessible if you go to if you go to Governor Northam's website. I offer that we have provided a brave space to here tonight. Notice I said a brave space to have a great conversation and dialogue where we will listen to each other and we will lean into our discomfort for some much needed conversation. Now, I'd like to welcome back Deputy Secretary of the Commonwealth, Tracy Chazer, our moderator for tonight's discussion.
Thank you, Secretary Moran, Governor Northam, and Dr. Underwood. We will now jump into the first portion of our discussion, racial equity and policing reform, a community perspective. I'm asking each panelist to offer brief responses of no more than 3 minutes if possible, so that we can ensure we're able to elevate as many questions as possible. We are joined by Ziana Bryant, community activist and member of the Virginia African American Advisory Board. Additionally, Ziana is a rising second-year student at the University of Virginia. Next, we are joined by Walter McCutcheon, community activist and pastor. We're also joined by Walter Jones, community activist representing We Are Change and Men in Suits. And rounding out our panel is Christine Payne, community and healthcare activist and member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council for the Virginia Nurses Association. First, thank you all for taking the time to join us and for your work to push your respective communities forward. You each represent various communities, and quite frankly, your activism looks different, though we recognize the importance of approaching our efforts through varied actions. One of my favorite writers, James Baldwin, once said, "I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." Over the past several months, we have seen an increased number of demonstrations throughout the Commonwealth and the nation doing just that, calling us to greater action. Ziana, with that, my first question is for you. Your activism and community organizing started long ago. Give us insight into what prompted your greater action and how you have been able to engage most recently.
So my work started when I was 12 in response to the murder of Trayvon Martin. And so right now, my work has turned into a very kind of responsive type of action to the misconduct and the violence that we're seeing from police all over the country, but also in response to the violence that we see from systems. And so it's so important to me that we remember when we're talking about defunding the police or we're talking about police reform, that we remember that our built environment also reflects into those systems and those kind of hidden structures that we don't see. So that includes voter suppression, that includes education inequalities, and disparities that exist within our public school systems. And so for me, it's so important that we're finding various ways to show up, but also that we're putting the voices of the most marginalized people to the forefront. So that includes Black women, Black trans people, and Black and brown people of the LGBTQ+ community, and also Indigenous voices. Until we're centering those voices and we're hearing from them first, we're not going to be able to really reform these systems the way that they should be. And so as we're out there in the streets, there are people who have differing opinions about how we should do the work. But I believe that we should create space for that tension, because it's within that tension that we actually learn about a diversity of tactics and that we understand that there are different experiences that exist. I've spent a lot of my time in both Richmond and Charlottesville for the past couple of months. And as an organizer, I've learned a lot about how we can do this work, how we can show up. We're fighting against evictions that are happening across the state. We're fighting to make sure that when schools reopen in in the midst of COVID, that Black and brown teachers especially are being well equipped and being protected. And so it's just so important that we're paying attention to how all of these systems are working together, because this fight is definitely multifaceted.
Thank you so much, Ziana. You bring up several interesting points and several interesting things that I think we're going to hit on throughout the evening. One of systems, you bring up and elevate the COVID-19 pandemic, which has certainly been kind of an added layer, an added dimension. And then also you bring up this tension, right? And this tension not necessarily being a negative thing, but this tension as being an opportunity for us to actually have those difficult conversations, as Dr. Underwood framed, and really coming together. So I appreciate that. Reverend McCutcheon, so Dante, this next question is for you. My apologies if I pronounced your name incorrectly the first go round. But this question that I'm going to pose to you is really around your efforts, since they're at the intersection of faith and advocacy. What role do you envision the church playing in partnering with government and law enforcement to move the conversation forward? Again, this is for Reverend McCutcheon. Dante.
Thanks. The role I believe that the church plays in between is to be active translators, to be connectors, to be able to discern and to interpret what people are saying, to give people a chance to understand one another as we journey toward justice. I think that is important to know what people are saying and how they're saying it. There's some things that are being said that everybody don't understand, and typically for the Black community, the church is the safe haven. The church is where most of us run to for shelter, for safety, and some of us do not go to church, but there's some type of person of faith. You know, there's some type of person of faith, and I believe that faith plays a huge role in this, and I believe that a lot of this trouble that we are experiencing is come from bad theology. And so I believe that the church has a serious role in connecting with faith, with justice, and things of that nature. And by me being a Christian and a follower of Jesus, I believe that that is what Jesus did. And so that's why I'm doing it.
I really appreciate that. And you said something that I hope everyone caught that's on the call this evening, and that's the church being playing this role as active translators, right? I found that in this work, oftentimes we are sitting in rooms and sitting across from one another, and we are saying the exact same thing, but we're not hearing each other. We're not taking the time to really pause and listen for understanding. Instead, we are listening to respond right away. And so it's interesting that you pose the church as kind of serving in this space of being active translators, whether you're active in the faith, in any particular faith or not, that the church can play this particular type of role. So I appreciate that. So Christine, just as with Dante, your efforts are kind of at this interesting intersection as well. So can you provide us with insight into how your work in healthcare called you into greater action around racial equity?
Thanks for that question. For me, advocacy and activism is just an extension of patient and community care, right? So nurses emphasize health and well-being, and that extends into our communities. We can't achieve personal wellness while our communities continue to suffer. And I've seen this period in time as a collision of two pandemics, the coronavirus, right? And this persistent, pervasive racism. It's right out in front of us. We've been home, we've been able to see it in front of our eyes on television. And with Black and brown communities so disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus, it's forcing us to take a hard look at where we are with racial inequity and the systems that perpetuate it. Nurses are natural coalition builders, and that's what we need to do. We need to be able to work for the equitable distribution of resources, health, and treatment under the law. That's the second part of our conference tonight, is talking about police reforms. And so we start with the relationships that we all have in our communities, whether they be in our neighborhoods, our places of worship, our civic organizations, in and out of our clinics and hospitals. And we start with intentional conversations in those spaces. and we build on those, and we reach out to other community organizations. And that's where the real work of coalition building starts. And that's what we're doing here tonight, is that coalition building. The change comes from those conversations, and the change is where we achieve wellness, personal wellness and collective wellness. I think that's really important, and I'm here to be a part of that transformation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that response. Again, we're hearing these themes around, conversations and dialoguing. And so I think that's something that we certainly want to hold on to throughout the evening and throughout the entire conversation. I want to bring, Walter, I want to bring you into the conversation. Your approach in many ways kind of likens back to the civil rights movement with men in suits. And so I want you to discuss your approach and what engagement in this call to greater action has looked like for you and within your community down in the Hampton Roads area.
Hey, how y'all doing to the panel, to the moderator, Mr. Chazer? I'm just happy to be here. I'm Walter Jones, like she said, the organizer of We Are Change. I graduated from Buffalo High School in Hampton, Virginia. Received my bachelor's degree from Norfolk State University, and I'm a direct descendant of William Tucker, the first African-American child born here in North America in our great state of Virginia. And I'm honored to be here on the panel. I'm kind of hesitant with the activist thing behind it, but I definitely got to go with it. There's been a lot of great leaders before me, but I just feel like it's time that anybody that's an everyday citizen, it's just time for everybody to stand up and come together and be a part of that change in the community. Basically, We Are Change is about making the positive change to ourselves first, so we can be able to help and make a positive impact in the communities around us. For example, We Are Change and Men in Suits, we did the Black and Blue Unity March where we all had suits, and we joined the police officers in Hampton and their families. And we walked from Historical Black College and Hampton University all the way to City Hall. We also gathered with our neighboring city, Newport News, and we got with Chief Drew, Newport News, and we did the walk from the South Precinct all the way to King Lincoln Park. We also did community resource fairs to get the community involved and out there. We had the police department, we had real estate agents, lenders, healthcare, nursing, even personal trainers, even judges, actually. And growing up, I never really saw that at a career fair. So it was good that the community came together for that, and also community cleanups and voter registration. And I feel like that's where the change starts, is that at every event, we try to have voters registration there. We try to have the city involved. We try to have the mayor of the city, the chief of police of the city, lieutenant governors, and even now, I'm grateful to be on a panel with Governor Northam because he's done a lot for the state of Virginia as well. And that's what it's all about, just making a positive change. And just to, at the end of the time that I have, I just want to let other people know that if you're a citizen and you're trying to do right, you can go about it. I believe everything to be in decency and in order. And to do that, if you're going to do any marches, include the city, include the police, collaborate with the city and the police. If you have a positive vision and you include all the right people, then everything will be in decency and order, and everything will turn out right. And just coming from ever since George Floyd happened, like I say, I'm a direct descendant of William Tucker. Every year they do something to honor the family for Virginia, and it just awoke something in me. And I'm just here to let anybody know that's a citizen that you can make a change in the community, no matter how big or too small, and don't waste your life.
I really appreciate you providing some additional background, Walter, on your family and your ancestors. And the reason I say this is because there's often this separation when we start to have these conversations. I think government is separated out, community activists and advocates are separated out. I think law enforcement is separated out. We are all members of this greater community. We all have family that are directly impacted by these issues. We have friends that are directly impacted. And so we are, in fact, in this together. And so I think it's important to note that as we continue the conversation moving forward. We have more time. We have time for more questions. And so I do want to get into a few more. And then I'm going to come back. And as we kind of wrap up this panel, I want to ask you all a question around where do we go from here? So I want you to be thinking about that before we get to, before we come to that. But first, I want to ask a few other questions. So Reverend McCutcheon and Ziana, this question is from Lady Wanche. And so the question is, I believe she's from Harrisonburg. The question is, increased training and policy change are important initial actions to mitigate concerns. I'll repeat that. Increased training and policy change are important initial actions to mitigate concerns. What then? What are ways in which we cultivate meaningful community-police relationships and authentic culture change? And so Reverend McCutcheon and Ziana, if you two would address that question.
So I think when there are policy changes, making sure that it's on paper that there are new procedures is very important. But deeper than that, I don't believe that it's just an issue of policy. I feel it's an issue of agency, who's at the table, and not just who's being invited to the table to have their voice heard, but who's genuinely being a part of those conversations of construction. So when we're building out these institutions or we're building out these systems, whose voices are being considered? And so I think the next step would be making sure that we're coming from a stance of co-creation. And what that looks like in schools with school resource officers, I feel like making sure that Black and Brown students know that they have a say in how things are going. At my school and in my school district, we have a student representative on the school board. And so I was a student representative during my senior year in high school, and I felt like my concerns were actually being addressed. And that could be replicated on the state level. We could have a statewide youth conference or a youth council that is a diverse group of voices and that is able to bring some of those concerns forward. But then in addition to just being at the table, there has to be measures for accountability. We need police oversight committees in every single community. Without them, we have people in power who are using their power unchecked. And that is not the spirit of the democracy that we hope and wish to uphold. And so when we're out in the streets and we're fighting and we're saying, you know, people go out to vote, people show up to the polls, and we have to also make sure that those people have the opportunity to hold their electeds accountable. So that would be my suggestion.
I appreciate that. And I'm going to jump in really quickly before you jump in, Reverend McCutcheon and Diana. There are a couple of things that you elevated that I don't want to get lost in the conversation. And that is this concept around asking the question of whose voices are being considered. This is something I know that you and I talk about often. I'm always asking you the question of who are the other people? Who are we missing? Are there other youth around the state that we can engage in? How do we ensure that we are reaching back and pulling up that seat for them to be a part of this conversation? There's something that several of my friends and I talk about when it comes to decision-making and policy. So there's this table, right, this proverbial table, and you have this seat at this table, and these decisions are being made in this room. But what we have found is that there are oftentimes an inner room when the real decisions and where the real decisions are actually being made. So I think it's very important for us to consider this. Who's a part of the conversation? Who has that seat at the proverbial seat at the table? But who's a part of the innermost decisions that are actually being made? So Reverend McCutcheon, what are your thoughts on that? Again, going back to Lady Wanche's question, that's what then? What are the ways in which we cultivate meaningful community police relationships and authentic culture change?
Well, first, I would say that it first be built on truth and that everybody is welcome and everybody is felt, everybody feels welcome. I think that's one of the issues that I've been having is a lot of people don't feel welcome. They don't feel like they are a part of a thing or that they can join the movement or things of that nature. So I think if we're talking about like maintenance and things to keep it going, we invite everybody and everybody gets a chance. One of the biggest things that I'm a person of faith, and my faith is communal. And so one of the biggest things that I believe is we have to do it as a community. We have to do it as a community, and those voices that are missing at the table, they need to be at the table. And if they are at the table, we need to give them room to speak, right? And so I just think that it's important to empower voices and to raise up voices that are people that have something to say, but we're not necessarily hearing them as much as we probably could or should. And I know earlier, I think it was Ziana, she mentioned about those persons, you know, being in the forefront. I think that we need to make room for them. But also when we talk about, you know, those that are marginalized, I want us to make sure that we remember all those who are marginalized, and so that we give them space, you know, our Black women, you know, our you know, LGBT community. But I also, as a brother from the hood, I mean, you know, I come from the projects, you know, I want us not to forget Black men. I don't want us to forget Black brothers, because we go through a lot. We've been going through a lot since we came over here. You know, we were embarrassed and all kind of stuff in front of our families and our wives and things of that nature. And so I want us to do this together. And I believe if we do it together, we're gonna make sure that it will continue, and that the right message won't get lost.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that and for elevating this concept of intersectionality, right? That's a word that is often tossed around, but do we understand what it truly means? And so I appreciate you elevating the LGBTQ plus community, appreciate you elevating Ziana as well, who talked about the importance of centering the voices of transgender people in the conversation as well, in particular trans women, because we have seen a significant amount of violence targeted specifically towards them as well. And then also our disability community, those that are differently abled, and how are we elevating their voices and ensuring that as we're having these conversations, we are also leaving that space at the table. So I think all critically important. Christine and Walter, I want to jump back over to you all first. By all means, if there's anything that you all wanted to add to this question, please jump in. But I want to ask you the question of, where do we go from here?
Ladies first. Christine.
Okay, well, thank you.
No problem.
Where do we go from here? It's about advocacy, and it's about making sure our priorities are heard in the General Assembly. Policing, the issues that we're talking about tonight are either state or local at this point in time. And it goes beyond, when we talk about criminal justice reform, it goes far beyond that. You know, we're in the middle of a budgetary crisis. So we've got to push for our priorities. We've got to make sure our schools are funded. I'd love to see tax reform in 2021 so that we can really take out the localities and make sure we're funding schools not based on who's making the money around the corner. But talk about that. Let's talk about funding for more mental health courts and substance abuse courts. Make sure that's in the budget. Let's make sure that we're still working on closing the school to prison pipeline. My own shout out to my own delegate, Mike Mullen. He's been working on that since he's been in office. There's lots of things that we can get done during special session. We've got to use our agency, and we've got to connect with people who don't have agency. So when I'm hearing Ziana say, you know, about the kids, I belong to the League of Women Voters and the Virginia Interfaith Center for Public Policy. We'd love to hear voices of those kids. We're looking for youth to have input. Those are, I would love to make those connections, to hear what they have to say, listen to their concerns, and then use our agency to take those concerns back, bring them with us. Let's have a conversation, a Zoom meeting with some legislators that are heading off to special session. I think that's what we do going forward, because it really is, it goes beyond rallies, it goes beyond roundtables, and it gets right to the heart of policy making. Who are our policy makers, and how do we influence them? I think that's where we go from here.
Thank you so much, Christine, for that thoughtful response. And this concept of agency is one that I want to elevate, right? And so those that have agency, right? So whether they are attached to an organization or have an affiliation, and those that don't, because your voices matter regardless of whether you have an attachment to an organization or not. But sometimes it's up for us to do a little bit more work to ensure we're actually listening to those voices.
That's absolutely right.
Perfect. So Walter, are you nodding? So where do we go from here?
Oh yeah, I'm agreeing with everything you guys are saying. I feel like I'm gonna go a different route, if that's okay. Just still to answer the question. I feel like we need to eliminate throughout the state of Virginia. We need to eliminate chokeholds and strangleholds throughout the whole state. I believe we need to eliminate the no-knock warrants. I was jotting some notes down when we was talking like you asked. I believe prohibiting hiring of officers fired or resigning for use of force. I also believe we need to create a local option for a citizen review board also. I believe we need to enhance the court's ability to expunge charges that have been dismissed. COVID relief also, and the last but not least, I have down allowed to earn sentence credit for those that's been incarcerated that have great behavior or good behavior. And I believe that'll be a positive change in moving forward and where we can go from here.
So I appreciate you elevating each of those very specific policy recommendations, Walter. What I'm going to do is I'll speak to a couple, and then what I'll do is we're going to transition to our law enforcement panel and hopefully give our law enforcement representatives the opportunity to address some of those. And then don't forget we have our administration representatives on the phone as well that can speak to some of that. One of the things that you talked about was expungement, and so I'm going to jump in on that one, and I know that we're joined by both the Secretary of the Commonwealth, Kelly Thomason, as well as the Secretary of Public Safety, Brian Moran. And then, of course, I serve as the Deputy Secretary of the Commonwealth. Oftentimes, people will contact our office seeking to get their records cleared or expunged, and we have to have that very difficult conversation with them that it doesn't quite look like that in Virginia, right? And so there isn't quite this expungement clause the way people think it may look because they've heard this term. And so it is a very difficult conversation. And so it's something that a concept that I'm glad you elevated. Now, in Virginia, in cases of acquittal or dismissal, you can, in fact, get your record expunged, but there is still a process to that. And so I say all this to say that I think there is also a gap in as laws and policies are passed, what we're doing to actually elevate and educate the community, on what laws and policies have actually been passed, and then what is the process by which you can go about addressing some of this. Now, our office focuses on or has the opportunity to facilitate the clemency process on behalf of the governor. The governor is able to pardon individuals or officially forgive them of their crimes, both individuals commuting the sentences of individuals that are currently incarcerated, and then also granting pardons to individuals that may have never served any time, right? And so typically, this is in the instance of an individual requesting what's called a simple pardon. This process is an extraordinary one, right? And it's one in which we take incredibly seriously, though we recognize that there are a number of people that this oftentimes is their only option, right? And so again, I just want to elevate those as we try to segue into our law enforcement panel and let you know that those policy recommendations are not lost in this conversation. We have time. Unfortunately, our time has come to an end for this discussion. And so what I'm going to do as we transition is first, thank you all for joining us and thank you for your thoughtful responses. I ask that you remain on the call with us for our later question and answer period. And again, those policy recommendations are not lost in this conversation. We will come back to those and we'll continue to a dialogue around them. So thank you so much. We're now going to jump into the next portion of our discussion, racial equity and policing reform, a law enforcement perspective. I am asking each panelist to offer brief responses of no more than 3 minutes, if possible, to ensure we're able to elevate as many questions as possible. We're joined by Larry Boone, Chief of Police of the City of Norfolk, Eric English, Chief of Police for the City of Harrisonburg, Maggie DeBoer, Chief of Police for the Town of Herndon, Steve Drew, Chief of Police for the City of Newport News, and Tim Carter, Sheriff for Shenandoah County and the President of the Virginia Sheriff's Association. I would like to start by asking each of you to address the following questions. How are you actively working to bridge the gap between community and policing in your respective communities? And are there specific examples that you can share? I'm going to go ahead and start things off with Chief Boone, and then followed by Chief DeBoer. Chief Boone?
Well, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. I want to thank the governor for putting this on, as well as Dr. Underwood. This is a very important topic. And as you all know, last year this time, the Norfolk Police Department, we were celebrating being recognized as the National Lip Sync Champions. And I bring that up because the energy you saw in that video is an indication of who we are as an organization as it relates to community engagement. I am happy to announce also, for the first time, we were nationally recognized by the IACP Police Chief Magazine for our community relations, for our 20+ community relations programs and initiatives. Some of those initiatives were covered by the Today Show, Cedric the Entertainer, the Nightly News with Lester Holt. And I highlight those because we've done some things in the Norfolk Police Department that we want to be known as the incubator of community engagement, and that we do things that are measurable. So let's talk about some of our programs. I've heard tonight folks talking about the school to prison pipeline. We have a literacy program where we interface with Title I schools for the whole school year. I have about 55 officers that are partnered with their kindergartner. And at the end of that school year, we have an individual, one that had a difficult time reading in the very beginning. At the end of the school year, he or she can read at their level. Now, as we all know, if you're not able to read by the time you hit the 3rd grade, your future does not look very well. I'm happy to highlight that we as an organization, we're doing our part to impact that school to prison pipeline. That's just one of our programs that was covered by the national media as well as international media. We also have a Clergy Patrol program. I have one sector in the city of Norfolk. We have 64 churches in one sector, and it's the most violent sector I have in the city. So I wanted to create a program where the clergy could ride with our officers so that they could see outside their church what's going on between Friday night and Saturday night. I can tell you it's given them a different perspective, one, by what the officers do, by what's going on outside their church, and it provides them with a mean where they can provide counsel and prayer in real time. Also, we have a Copsicle mobile. Now, picture this. About a year ago, we had an ice cream truck in our community that was selling drugs from the ice cream truck. So un-American. We arrested that individual, confiscated that ice cream truck, made markings so that it would look like a police car. So instead of that truck going into our communities and selling drugs, we're now providing ice cream to our youth and breaking down those stereotypes and building relationships starting where they're young, just like we're doing with our literacy program, starting where they're young. Someone mentioned something about the LGBTQ+ community. Well, we also created the very first general order policy in how we interface with the LGBTQ+ community. I want my officers to treat them with dignity and respect, and I want to give them a platform in how to navigate in that space. We talked about diversity. Someone mentioned that earlier tonight. I'll go on a record and I'll say we are the most diverse police department in the state. And diversity is not enough. It's not enough because you have to have inclusiveness as well. So when I say that, we have people sitting at the table from the ranks of assistant chief to captain, lieutenant, sergeants, and corporals, all inclusive, ranging from females to LGBTQ+ to African Americans. They all have input on what goes on in this department and how we're going to look in the future. Now, someone will say, Chief, that's nice. What about your core function, crime reduction? So I'm happy to say in the last 4 years, the city of Norfolk have experienced double-digit reductions, the safest this city has ever been in the history of this police department. At one point, we had a reduction of 32% in violent crime. Now, that's unheard of. Now, we are in a very peculiar situation. We've been here before. going back 30 years with Rodney King, Ferguson, and George Floyd. Now, let's not take this moment just to celebrate the problem. We do a lot of talking. We have yet to take the issue and create measurable outcomes. We got one time to fix this, folks. We are in this together, and we need to fix this together, because if we don't, we'll be here again. And in closing, you know, we've had multiple protests in the city of Northam. Not one time did we have one car set on fire, a broken window, a fight, an arrest, an injury, none of that, because we did the heavy lifting before the incident. We started meeting with folks prior to Ferguson. We'll meet with anyone. I don't care if it's the original New Black Panther Party, Black Lives Matter, the community activists that nobody particularly cares for, because those people are important. They have a barometer. They have their thumb, the pulse on the thumb to know what's going on in the community. And without them, you got blind spots. You simply have blind spots. And I want to close this with this. Our officers in the Norfolk Police Department, you know, we had multiple protests. And I got to say, they at times were insulted. Not all the time, but at times they were insulted. And you know what those officers did? They absorbed that insult and cleared those streets and blocked that traffic so that those protesters can exercise their First Amendment rights. Ladies and gentlemen, we are the Norfolk Police Department. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those numerous examples, Chief Boone. I've had the opportunity to now get to know you very well over the past year or so, and very familiar with your work and with your efforts. Chief DeBoer, before we jump over to you, there were a couple of things that I want to highlight from Chief Boone's remarks, and that's going to be some of these themes that came up in our community panel. And so we're starting to see some intersections here, which is what we want to get to. This is what a dialogue is about. Reverend McCutcheon spoke on the intersection of faith and the importance of faith community, and this is something that you spoke about, Chief Boone. Christine talked about the importance of, and Diana as well, around accountability and measuring and this continued dialogue. So again, all themes and efforts that it sounds like are taking place down in the Norfolk community. So thank you for that. Chief DeBoer, I want to now turn things over to you, and you are also doing a tremendous amount of work in your community. If you could provide us with some of your best practices.
Sure, I appreciate the opportunity to represent Herndon and also the Virginia Chiefs here tonight. You know, this is an opportunity for us to really highlight the great work we've not only been doing, but we've been doing here in Herndon for years. And, you know, everybody's community is different. And whether your community is made up of a variety of African American, Hispanic, Middle Eastern, whatever, we all have unique communities. And Northern Virginia up here, we're a melting pot. So we have a lot of opportunity to have dialogue and understanding up here. But in Herndon, you know, our unique community and our more challenging community for us from a policing perspective has been our immigrant community, largely Hispanic, but also from other parts of the world. And that is all about building, fostering, and creating relationships. And that's been a very big challenge for us, because we know one thing: we can't effectively police our community at all without trust and support of our citizens and our residents here. And so the challenge there has been cultural for us. So part of it has been, you know, we're dealing with a population up here that has a cultural fear of the police because of where they came from, which is really significant for us. And it's something we've had to come to a really good understanding about. We've had to learn about the impact of trauma on that, on many of those border crossing kids that we deal with. And also really to really make our job challenging is the language barriers that we deal with on a regular basis. So we decided to attack this from a different standpoint, and it's all about trying to make inroads with our youth. So we've done that. Instead of trying to create a program that we really can't sustain necessarily, we've detached ourselves to institutions, and in this case, it's been the school, because the kids already trust the schools, they already trust their teachers and their counselors there, and those people have made the connections with the police and these kids. And we started a program here. One of our counselors up at Hutchinson Elementary School in Herndon, Renee Gorman, started a program called Project Hope and brought us right into the fold. And Project Hope was a way for us to build trust and relationship with our immigrant communities. And that program has gotten national recognition from the Police Executive Research Forum and recognized for best practice. And I will tell you, there's nothing more powerful when we meet with these kids at the beginning of a school year and they're afraid to look at us, they're afraid to talk to us. And we meet with them once a week, but we do simple stuff. We go into the school after school, we play Uno with them, we have a snack with them, we go out and shoot basketball with them. And they won't interact with us or give us much eye contact. By the middle of the year, they're looking for us. They're calling us out by name. And I'll give you a couple examples. There was an instance where we had an international day where not only did we get to connect with the kids, but we brought their parents in. And the police officers involved and the parents involved brought a dish from their home country. And we all shared a meal together, and they put a pin map out. And we put little pins on the map where their heritage came from. The police officers did the same thing. And we had a great conversation. We shared food. And one of the parents from the Central American country he dealt with said that, you know, he was almost in tears, saying he could never, ever imagine himself sitting with a police officer and sharing a meal. It was a powerful, powerful moment for us, and realized how important that program is. And there's one other one that I will mention. It is truly a situation in the summer of Project Hope where we have a straight 3-week program. And there were a few girls in the back of the room, and the counselor said, Chief, go back there and talk to those girls. They don't like the police. So I went back there. They had their phones out, and they were talking about, they were showing videos of police brutality. And I said, do you really think that's what we do? Is that all we do? And they're like, well, it's here, right here. And we started a dialogue, and these were 6th graders. We started a great dialogue. And it didn't have much discussion. 3 weeks later, I was being chosen to be on their soccer team when we had a game. So, you know, you see progress in little ways, right? Little ways, but they're big, big steps for us. So I know my time is limited here, but I just want to say that, you know, it is about planting the seeds with this generation so that maybe long after I'm gone, you know, we have this youth that understand what we do and what our roles are. And it's about collaboration. It's about trust. And it's about safety for all of us. So that's our way of making inroads here. There's lots of other programs, but that's been our most successful to date.
So I really appreciate you providing those very specific examples, Chief DeBoard. And I feel like you really built on some of Chief Boone's examples and models, right? That it doesn't have to be this complicated thing. It could be as simple as, you know, figuring out a time to sit down and play Uno, or pulling out a map and talking about, where are you from? Well, this is where I'm from, and let's talk about our shared experiences, or converting an ice cream truck over and still offering ice cream from it, but, you know, with the under the mark or under the guise that it is actually a law enforcement truck or the agency's vehicle. There were a couple of other things that you brought up. First was around this lack of trust, and I think there is something to be said about that. If you look within the Black and African American community, historically, there is a lack of trust, right? When you look at how we have historically been addressed by law enforcement, what that engagement has looked like, and I oftentimes offer this example. When you are in elementary school and when you are in middle school, something happens, right? In elementary school with law enforcement, you get to look at the shiny lights. You get to look at the officer's belt. You get to learn about opportunities to work in law enforcement and serve. In middle school, there's a transition that happens. Your conversation is now centering around drugs, and you're perhaps engaging with a DARE officer. And then when you transition into high school, it starts to look just a bit different, right? And so it sounds like what you all have been able to do is, as youth kind of grow up in the community, as families move into communities, you're able to establish trust early on, right? Now, that's for the Black and African American community. There's also something to be said in your message around the engagement with the Hispanic, Latino, and Latinx community, and what that lack of trust has looked like, perhaps from home countries, right? And so trying to establish that trust here. Another example, and this is something that I became aware of about a year or so ago in dialoguing with someone around engagement efforts around the census, and that was the lack of trust of government and law enforcement that older Vietnamese Americans have, right? And oftentimes we forget because we're removed from the Vietnam War, right? But recognizing that those impacts of these different moments and inflection points in our history are still very real for members of the community, so I appreciate that. I think this is a good opportunity to segue into how we actually bridge these gaps, And so I want to turn things over to Sheriff Carter, Chief English, and Chief Drew. How are you all working to bridge the gap? And I'll start with Sheriff Carter, if you'd like to share some of what you're doing in your local community.
As far as bridging the gaps within our communities, sheriffs are a direct reflection of their communities. One of the things that we do here is we have several community groups that are active throughout the county and making sure that we have constant communication with those groups. Also making sure that we seek out and conversations with the groups that we wouldn't normally have conversation with. Those are some of the things that we're doing here with regard to gaps and things like that.
Thank you so much, Sheriff Carter. Is there anything anything else you wanted to share about your work in the Shenandoah?
Well, one of the things I think that your previous panelists hit on that I would like to touch on. Again, I did mention sheriffs are a direct reflection of their communities. The sheriff has a direct relationship with every person in the community. Through our democratic process, you actually have a voice with regard to who your sheriff is and whether your sheriff stays in that position or not. That is something that's unique about sheriffs. With regard to one other point that was brought up earlier, we have a very robust, in this county, have a very robust relationship with youth in our county. One of the things that we do is we have a youth leadership program that's a summer camp that we do each year for children in the county, middle school age children. We try to develop relationships with those children, try to help them understand about developing relationships with schools, school administrators, their own peers, and deal with things like bullying and those types of incidents that they're going to come in contact with. We try to take young leaders and make them better leaders. Of course, we do those, and I think if you ask all sheriffs throughout the Commonwealth, you'll find that they're very intricately involved in community volunteerism, whether it be for Rotary groups or Kiwanis or Lions or churches or what have you. I would say that almost all sheriff's offices are connected one way or the other with community groups like that and efforts that they make with people throughout the community, whether they're advantaged or disadvantaged, what have you.
Thank you so much for that, Sheriff Carter, and really kind of framing, the role of sheriffs in the community. I think there's a lack of understanding around the role between the law enforcement agency in a community and then the sheriff's department and how you all work together. So certainly appreciate you sharing a little bit more insight into that.
Thank you.
So I want to ask the same question about bridging the gap to Chief English and Chief Drew as well. And so if you could share a little bit about the work that you're doing in your respective communities and how you all are working to bridge this gap between community and public safety.
So I would just say a couple quick things. I think what you'll see as a common theme amongst many of us when it talks about transparency, partnerships, collaboration, inclusiveness. I think that's pretty consistent across the board. And so one of the things we try to do here, and I know Ziana mentioned it in her conversation about policy. Policies are our guidelines. And I think it's important, as she mentioned, that there are voices at the table that have some opportunity to have some input in what they want their police, how they want their police officers to police their communities. And so we've had several different communities and nonprofits actually draft or help review our policies to ensure that what we're doing is inclusive of how they want their communities policed. So I think that's important for them to make sure your community has a voice in ensuring that your policies kind of mirror how they want your agency to work. Secondly, I think it's important for you to be as transparent as you can. So one of the things we've tried to do is make sure we put out as much information to our community as we can. So our policies are posted, use of force data is posted. All those things I think are officers that are part of Big Brothers Big Sisters. I think it's important for us to make sure we have some communication with our elementary school kids. Many of those kids are in need. And I think, you know, for us, we try to make sure that we have a strong communication with our youth. Even through COVID, some of the things we try to do, even we didn't have contact at schools, we developed a community convoy where we had police officers and other city agencies, and we just rode through neighborhoods just so we could see our kids that we weren't able to see during this pandemic. We also use our robot. We recognize kids, and we used our robot and took lunches to kids using our robot. So we try to stay connected, doing different things and thinking outside the box, trying to utilize those things. And lastly, I will say that we formed a community relations board. We have about 11 individuals that are very diverse group of individuals. And what we try to do is we try to be intentional in our conversation. And so to give you an example, the last conversation was centered on how do they want police responding to mental health calls. And so what we try to do is be as transparent with them as we can, and we show them videos of what we do and what we go through when we have to respond to those calls. And we ask them the question, what is your expectation of your police department on mental health calls? And so we try to be really, really transparent with that group, and we get some very good information from them, how they want us to train. So that's how it's paying dividends for us, because we're trying to be as transparent and be in collaboration with our community. So I think all those things are important for us.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Chief English. I'm going to jump over to Chief Drew to answer the same question. You know, how do we bridge these gaps, and what are some of the things that you all are doing in your community?
Well, can you hear me okay? We're good. Well, listen, I think, first of all, I want to thank Governor Northam and you all for putting this panel together and allowing us to be a part of it. It's very humbling, it's very timely, and it's worthy to spend time on these conversations. First, in Newport News, we have a foundation here, a focus on community policing. We're founded on the 21st century policing model. It came out of President Obama's administration under Chief Ramsey and the diverse group that he put together, the diverse panel, to talk about how do we police in today's society. And out of the 6 pillars, the one that I've heard most people talk about tonight, and I would agree, is trust and transparency. We have to earn the trust of the citizens that we represent, as well as the men and women who wear this uniform, both sworn and civilian in this organization. One of the things that we've done here in the last couple of years is we've created a community youth and outreach division, a division that would focus, made up of school resource officers and other community officers, one division that would focus on large-scale events of community interaction, whether it's with the YMCA, the Boys and Girls Club, our churches. We're going to talk about that. We also have a homicide support group to make sure that we understand that the individuals who've lost loved ones to violence, that they're not forgotten. We know that they've lost loved ones and they hurt. But it also helps us as officers, detectives, the chief of police to understand how we can better serve and work with individuals who have lost loved ones, how we treat the survivors better, how we make things easier to get through. But we do have a citizens advisory board. One of the things we talk about with youth, and that's probably the biggest passion I have, is young adult police commissioners. Chief English and I, when we were both in Richmond, worked with this group. But it is a freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior from every high school here in Newport News. We meet with them weekly, and we have youth forums, and they kind of facilitate those forums, much like you're doing tonight in the high schools. And we have real hard, truthful conversations about diversity, police, and interaction. How do they see their department? How do they see their government? What things would they like to see better? They have a voice. And I think we've seen that more and more today as we look across the conversation across our country, that youth want to be heard. And I think it's important to bring them to the table. We have 26 elementary schools in Newport News. I don't have an officer in each school, but we have adopted each school. So there's an officer who's accountable for each school, whether it's a summer reading program that we've done throughout the COVID epidemic that we have now, where we're just reading a book every other day to students, right, to elementary kids. Or we're going by the elementary schools and having lunch. You heard the chief talk about that, interacting with them. And that can be hazardous pay right there in the lunchroom, I'm telling you. But it is fun and it's exciting, right, to interact with those kids and see their face when they walk in. And how do we continue to build those relationships, as you talked about, middle school and high school? Citizen engagement. We have every promotional process that we go through. If someone wants to be promoted to a sergeant or lieutenant or move up the ranks in this field, we have citizens from our community on those panels. They ask different questions that a chief or other law enforcement officials may ask. You know, they're going to talk about things in the community and how they see their culture and different ideas. So we incorporate citizens to sit on those panels. Some are faith leaders, teachers, professionals, retirees. We do have a use of force review board, and I heard a little bit about citizen oversight. Our use of force review board is made up of officers and citizens, an equal number. and they sit together and they look at body-worn camera video, right? All of the officers here in Newport News, just about like everywhere else, have body-worn cameras, and they watch the incident occur. And they look at these together, and it's facilitated, and they have those discussions together, and they come to 3 conclusions. That the use of force was in policy, it was out of policy, or was in policy, but are there some things we could do better? But I think that's important to bring people together of law enforcement and citizens to both see what's going on and have conversations and express concerns. We talked a little bit about faith and working with our faith leaders. We have our chaplains program, but I remember Dante and Walter both kind of talked about it, about working together and about bringing our working with our faith leaders in our churches. I think that's vital. Just one I'd like to highlight is the Virginia Unity Project. Now, we may talk about that a little later, but that is a group of faith leaders of all different faiths and race to come in, and we've asked them to talk to our police recruits. We've asked them to talk to our new individuals who have received promotions that are going to be the next leaders in this organization. And we also have them talk about the executive staff and the chief of police, and they talk about how they face some of the same challenges that police do. How something that happens in Oakland, California is going to affect policing in Virginia. So we talk about those things, and I think that's important. And I'll tell you, I'm going to make sure I get her name right because she's so important to me, right? Albion Lyons has done such a great job facilitating conversations, and I think she's on one of the panels coming up. When we talk about police reform, and Walter hit on it a lot, conversation, dialogue, respecting one another. We may not always agree, but to be able to sit at a table, I think that's important. The last things I want to talk about is I think there has to be a focus on training. I want to make sure in this department that we continue to focus on cultural diversity, de-escalation, anti-bias-based police training, mental health calls. And like Chief English and others talked about, we may not be the best individuals to first respond to those calls, but I think a lot of things, I heard Chief Boone talk about it as well, is that a lot of that falls back on law enforcement because we're here 24 hours. They can respond. But working with our mental health institutions, our behavioral health, our psychologists and paramedics, those things are all important. As we talk about, I want to continue training on how to address issues with homelessness. Autism, I think, is vital, and making sure that we understand each other, self-respect, cultural diversity. Domestic violence is an issue that we continue to have issues with here in Newport News, just like anywhere else. And we talk about some of the challenges when we partner with outside agencies. Well, can you share reports? Can you share information? We decided that this year we're going to try something different, try to think outside the box. We hired 2 domestic violence advocates, individuals who specialize in domestic violence and training and how to help individuals, right? They do a couple things for us. They follow up on calls, on a domestic call that we have. They make a phone call and talk to the victim, male or female, later on, help prepare for the court case. But they also teach officers that when we walk through that door in a domestic violence case, how important it is to connect with the victim right away. And it is just we talk about education and training. It's bringing outside specialists, some that are on this panel tonight, right, to come in and talk to our recruits, and not just the new officers, the officers that go through in-service training every 40 hours each year, that we're learning new and best practices. I want to know what Harrisonsburg is doing that I can mold and work here in Newport News. I want to know what Chief Boone is doing in Norfolk. You know, to call him and how would you handle this situation? What are the things that you've experienced? All of those things together, I think it comes down to measurables. We can measure it with crime reduction. Thankful right now we're seeing our 3rd year row in crime reduction. Our clearance rates increasing, our complaints decreasing, and our use of force, our complaints decreasing, and our use of force incidents as well dropping. All of those things are elements that help shape the community perception of law enforcement here in Newport News, but I think across the country, we have to continue to build on that and move forward.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for taking the time to join us tonight and offer those best practices. We can spend, another hours, quite frankly, I think, really digging into each of those, but there are some themes, and I appreciate Chief Drew. I appreciate you for kind of bringing those themes together, or those pillars that we discussed, right? So trust, transparency, accountability, specifically, how are we measuring our approaches? And so I don't want any of that to be lost in the conversation. We will, in fact, be joined by Albion here shortly, and so I appreciate you also bringing up the Virginia Unity Project, and so we'll discuss that here in a moment. But again, those themes of distrust and transparency and accountability, and then something else that you shared that I think each of our law enforcement officials on this panel this evening has demonstrated they are doing, and that is thinking outside of the box. Each of you has stretched your departments, your agencies, to really truly consider how can we deepen our engagement with our community? And I appreciate the fact that many of you called on some of the recommendations that were elevated by our community panel as well. Now, we intentionally wanted the opportunity to engage with community and to engage with law enforcement, and now we want to bring this conversation together. So at this time, what we're going to do is we're going to bring back the governor, Secretary Moran, and Dr. Underwood. They're going to be joined by Curtis Brown, Virginia's first ever African-American state coordinator for emergency management, Albion Lyons, the head of communications with the Virginia Unity Project, as well as all of our panelists from this evening. And so as we bring everyone together, we're now going to go in a series of questions. As I asked earlier, I want you all to continue to keep your responses brief so that we can continue moving through the previously submitted questions, as numerous questions as we can, okay? So that's our goal tonight, to move through as many questions as we can, because we do have numerous submitted. So Governor, I'm gonna kick things over to you, and I'm gonna ask you the question. Hopefully you can still hear us, sir. But the question is from Max Blaylock, and he wants to know, what changes in policies, laws, and procedures are your top priorities to move towards the goal of racial equity and in our criminal justice system? And I'm gonna add something additional to that. So along those lines, Governor, are there policies and legislative proposals that you think should be considered during the special session to reform police departments and police culture? So Governor, are you there?
I am, and just listening to all of our panelists, you all are amazing, tremendously powerful, and I just, on behalf of Virginia, just thank you all for being part of this tonight. And to our MC, Tracy Chazer, you know, I've worked with Tracy for a number of years, but Tracy, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but you are tremendously talented. I think you should be a talk show host. So I'd like to see a clap of hands for Tracy Chazer. So thank you all for that. So for the question, I appreciate the question. And, you know, throughout our administration, I've been committed to creating a fairer and more equitable Virginia. Meaningful reforms to our criminal justice system and policing practices are a critical component of achieving this goal. And as Secretary Moran mentioned earlier, we have made a lot of progress in these areas, but we know that there is still a lot of work to do. So we're looking forward to continuing this work during the upcoming special session and then the regular session, which starts in January. Tonight's event and this conversation will help to inform and shape our approach. And I intend to put forward several proposals that will address, number one, how law enforcement training in Virginia is created and delivered, which includes making sure communities are involved in the process. Creating best practices for civilian review boards. You all talked about that tonight. Reviewing law enforcement officers intervene when they see a colleague breaking the law or acting unethically. Information sharing between hiring agencies and previous employers, and expanding the criteria for which a law enforcement officer can be decertified when they engage in unlawful or unethical behavior. So we have a very ambitious agenda for August the 18th, and we're listening. And as I said, it is time to turn words into action. That's what Virginians expect, and we're prepared to do that in August. We're going to get a lot of good things done in August, and then, you know, right around the corner will be January. So what we do in August, that's not where we stop. So please continue to be involved. I love hearing that we need more youth. That's a great message. Let's be involved. Let's work together, and let's continue to make Virginia more inclusive and a Commonwealth where everybody will feel comfortable, where they'll be respected, and where they can enjoy our tremendous quality of life. So thanks to all of you for being on tonight. And finally, to all of our viewers, I understand there are over 1,000 viewers. To you and your families, thank you, and be safe and be healthy, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you all so much.
Wonderful. Thank you for that response, Governor, and sharing with us a little bit about some of your priorities as we approach the special session. I will forgive you, sir, for giving me the boot and kicking me into television. So we'll talk about that later. but we do appreciate you sharing a little bit about your priorities as we approach the special session.
Thank you, Tracy.
So, of course, sir. I'm going to jump into a few other questions. And so the governor has outlined some of these priorities and some of the things that we're taking a very close look at. And it seems like there are some themes that are in alignment with some of the concerns and some of the policy recommendations that have been elevated throughout the conversation. So I want to jump back over to our law enforcement officers for a moment. This question is from Charles Swadley. And forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your last name, but he asked, is there training for implicit bias? So do officers have this sort of training? And is there any sort of policy to pair up maybe professional volunteers in mental health situations? So if an individual finds themselves in crisis, you know, how can we maybe partner up some professionals? So this question is actually for Chief English and Chief DeBoard, but by all means, if there are others that want to jump in on this, please do so. So either Chief English or Chief DeBoard, did you want to speak to either of those questions?
Sure, I'd like to address the bias training. You know, the Virginia Chiefs jumped on this pretty quickly in June when a lot of these issues rose to the surface, and we have been working to provide professional training for all of our police officers and certainly our leadership throughout the state. One of the very first course that we launched on our training portal for the Virginia Chiefs Association was a 4-hour bias policing training portal, and we have made this free to every police officer throughout the state of Virginia. I know agencies are probably approaching this very similar to how we've done it in Herndon. I've given my officers a month to complete the training, and it's mandatory training. It actually was done very, very well. And, you know, I don't think that any of us could have not sat through that training and said we didn't learn something historically that we didn't know before. I know I did myself. So I think it's going to help to open minds a little bit. We are certainly open to that. And we were really quick to get that out, but we have made that free for every agency. And I know we have, you know, over 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, I think upwards now that we have officers that have already signed on and taken that training. So I'll let Chief English take the other half of that if he'd like.
Yeah, I think it is important when you talk about dealing with mental health. I think it's a great idea to have somebody from a mental health worker that partners with police. I know here in Harrisonburg, we have a mobile crisis team. Again, while it may not be the end all be all, it does help when you have a mental health worker that is responding with law enforcement. I always say that I'm not sure that we're the best entity to respond to those type of calls because, you know, just from the optics of itself, if I'm in a mental health crisis, I don't know if the first person I want to see is somebody that has a gun and a taser. So we got to find ways for us to be able to pull back from some of those mental health calls, but at the same time, we can't eliminate ourselves from those because a lot of times we're going into situations that are very dangerous, and so you just can't send a civilian into those positions. But partnering, I think, is a wonderful idea. It's something that I've been having conversations with our community service board about. I think it needs to be more of that, and so that's going to be a huge push for us, and I think that's a great idea.
Thank you both for addressing that question. To our other law enforcement personnel on the call, I am going to come back to you, but I want to make sure we're getting in as many perspectives as possible into this conversation. So Dr. Underwood, I have a question for you, and then Director Brown, I have a follow-up for you after this question that I'll present to Dr. Underwood. So many questions we've received centered on training and equity, and of course we just had 2 law enforcement officers that talked about the importance of that training. The question I would like to present to you is from Ashley Marshall, and her question is, would it be possible to expand the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, don't quit Dr. Underwood, to support providing assistance to law enforcement officers who request it? And also, can that office be expanded to have staff in all state departments, including HR? So can you speak a little bit about your work and perhaps how you may be partnering with the Office of the Secretary of Public Safety in your efforts?
Thank you for that question. I will share with everyone, all the listeners, that I am in the process of expanding my office and hiring for permanent positions during the next 18 months. But my office is also uniquely linked to the Department of Human Resource Management. And so there is a very intentional link, because I do want to share with you that my office is not necessarily an EEO office in terms of compliance, but it really is about thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion from a proactive perspective. And so how can we think about our leaders, our legislation, and the logistics? So for example, informal and formal policies and procedures throughout state government, and then the extent to which other sectors want to follow these our guidelines. We are right now thinking about how do we extend diversity, equity, and inclusion to all 100 plus state agencies, and we've been rolling out and thinking through what does that look like. For example, the One Virginia plan. But specifically to the question, there is not an opportunity necessarily for my office to partner with each law enforcement agency, if I understood your question, across the Commonwealth. But it is very important for us to partner with public safety and homeland security because it's such a natural relationship. So I have been just absolutely enjoying this idea of having these conversations with Secretary Moran, and how do we reform the Virginia State Police? How do we diversify the Virginia Department of Emergency Management? We know that public safety agencies in general lack diversity. That are very largely white and male. And so there are specific best practices in which we can do that, and that includes not only those in the public safety and homeland security secretary, but also in natural resources, our conservation law enforcement as well, which is another area that I've really delved into to try to think about how do I link arms with, our agencies that police our waters and our state parks. And so I'm really excited about the work ahead and building momentum in these areas.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that response, a very thorough response, Dr. Underwood. We certainly appreciate it, and also for allowing me to make that joke. And I made that because we do call on Dr. Underwood often, and she has done a tremendous amount to really get us to think about diversity in its truest sense, right, and consider all of those dimensions of diversity as we're moving forward in our efforts. Something that Dr. Underwood shared, I think, is the perfect segue into my question for Director Brown. You are the first African-American state coordinator for emergency management. Many may know that you also previously served as the Deputy Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security. You come to us with a very interesting set of experiences in that a lot of your work has been intentional around diversity and inclusion. So this question is actually from Johnny Underwood. And it talks about, or he's asking, what specific things can be done to diversify the workforce and public safety agencies in general, and then change the culture to retain a diverse workforce? Because there's something to be said for recruitment, but then that second component is how do we actually retain that diverse workforce? So Director Brown, if you're still there, I know that you are dealing with the storms, so we appreciate your time, and if you can address that.
Thank you, Deputy Secretary. And it seems like tonight was a lot better than the other night. So a lot of warnings, but it doesn't seem like any impact. But I think that's a great question. I believe you need diversity and inclusion. You need an environment that people want to come to and work and grow and be supported as they move through their careers. And when you have a non-diverse environment, you're more likely to have an environment that's not inclusive of diversity. And so you really have to focus in on training, comprehensive training for new employees, supervisors, and all employees. And it's not just a check the box one time only, it's continuous through their careers, because we want to create an environment that people want to come to work, that's inclusive of women and people of color in leadership. And you have to look at your HR policies and practices to make sure that they're inclusive. And that we're looking in places where we historically have not looked at. Emergency management nationwide, 80 to 85% is white male. And I see it as a direct correlation to the lack of representation in the field and the disproportionate impact of disasters on communities of color. And so if we want to change this trend, we have to be very intentional in our efforts to diversify the field and integrate equity into understanding how we can eliminate these disproportionate impacts understand why the vulnerability exists in communities of color and take efforts to integrate building resilience in an equitable fashion. But you have to do both. You cannot do one without the other. We do have people of color within organizations who are dealing with discrimination and racism. That has to be addressed. And when people go against those rules and they misbehave and are discriminatory, there has to be accountability as well. So I think it's comprehensive, it's fully integrated as a priority of the leadership, and it takes a lot of work and effort. But over time, you're going to see the increase in the number of diversity and inclusive environment.
Excellent. We really appreciate sharing that. And then there was something that you elevated that I don't want lost, and that's this concept of diversity and inclusion, and then also resilience, right? And so that's kind of a different use of the word resilience that I'm not sure many of us have heard before. And so I want us to hold on to that. And I actually want to bring Albion into the conversation. Of course, Chief Drew mentioned the Virginia Unity Project early on in the discussion, but the work that you have done has been unique. It's been different, and really, you are a communicator by trade and by training. And so, what opportunities do you see for collaboration with law enforcement and government? And then, if you can maybe bring in some of what Director Brown said around diversity, inclusion, and resilience as we consider just diversifying our spaces.
So thank you so much for this opportunity this evening. I am so grateful to be inside of this conversation, because ultimately what we're talking about is creating the right environments for the kind of America that each and every one of us wants to believe in. You know, sometimes we get so political over what America is and whether or not people are patriots who challenge the status quo inside of America. But the most patriotic thing we can do is to believe that America is capable of living up to her promise. And what we're working to do collectively is to lean into the discomfort that will allow for that to be possible. So let me speak a little bit to why the Virginia Unity Project operates the way that we do and how we use communication as a mechanism for being able to move our communities forward. You see, the thing that most people forget, and my training is in psychology and counseling, right? So what most people forget is that the human condition is to lean towards default zones. And what I mean by that is what I refer to as information, revelation, application, or IRA. If you're really going to invest in helping a community move forward in positions of authority, you need to make sure that that IRA works. Information is your training mechanism. So when we're working on training police, that is all at the eye level. That's cerebral. But revelation is what happens when you move what's at the cerebral level to the heart level. Because people don't do what they know. People generally do what it is that they believe. And ultimately, what we want to do is to change what people believe when it comes to their relationships inside of the communities. And that cannot be done in simple trainings that are, and I mean no disrespect when I say this, but if America could be fixed in a few hours, we'd be fixed already. So the reality is that it is an ongoing process for us. A single training won't fix what it is that America has been unfortunately sick with for generations. It is a constant work. So we go in and we do the real conversations that move that information to revelation such that application will become the default zone. The work that we've had an opportunity to do when you think globally and act locally. So Virginia Unity Project, while it has a state vision, it does not rest on its laurels in terms of its responsibilities at the local level. So we work very diligently with our local police department. We absolutely adore Police Drew because of his commitment to relationships being fundamental to the mechanism by which they police. When we go in and have conversations with the police department, we ask the hard questions, like things like, do you have Black friends? I know it seems like such an unusual question to ask, but it is essential to you being able to see someone the way that you would love. As in, when I am dealing with this issue, do I see my friend? Do I see my cousin? Do I see my son? Do I see my aunt? If I cannot relate to you on a human level, and I only know you at a cerebral level, it is very hard for me to respond in my default zone in accordance to the way that we would like to see policy enacted. Policy is wonderful and it is essential to function. There's no question about it. But it's no different than a speeding limit. There are lots of us who see that sign every day. It's designed to keep us safe, but 90% of us break it when nobody's watching. The goal is to have such deep change at the subconscious level that when you see that sign, it would not matter whether or not it was covered with a sheet, you would still be abiding by that because you were doing what you believe, not just what you were taught. So our goal is to do the hard work in real dialogue, real exchange, closed doors, confidentially, so that it's okay for people to not know. It's okay for people to say the inappropriate thing, the non-politically correct thing, because it's inside of that space that we can address the issues in a non-judgmental way. The one thing that is never going to heal the divide between communities is demonization. You can't fix that which one demonizes. We are in this American experience together. So as faith leaders, as community leaders, it is our responsibility to believe in the potential of our brothers and sisters inside of this community. So regardless of what has happened in the history of policing or even the current challenges that we are facing, the mission cannot the mission has to be, I should say, greater than the moment. The moment may say, divisiveness. The moment may say fear. The moment may say questioning. But if the mission is unity, then that has to speak louder to us than the moment, which is fundamental to those of us who are believers. We have to believe that the same God who saw us in our sinful state, believed in our possibility, that we can see our brothers and sisters in the community in an imperfect state and believe in the possibility of who they can be inside of the authority that they represent. So we take all of these things into consideration as we do very intimate work behind the scenes in ways that people have the opportunity to grow safely and honestly, and to be able to move that which is known cerebrally to a heart level so that we can see the kind of application that our country deserves.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. You organically shared many of the kind of concerns and kind of points that I think those that submitted questions wanted to elevate it. And one thing that you shared that was central to some of those questions was getting to the heart of the matter. Right, and that being critically important to moving this conversation forward. At the heart of any community is also our youth, our children. And so I think this is a good opportunity to ensure we're coming back to our youth and centering them in this conversation as well. So Secretary Moran, I actually want to bring you into the conversation here, and I want you to speak to juvenile justice. And at one point, not too long ago, Virginia was one of the worst states for juvenile justice. And so I want you to speak to efforts over the past several years to better support Virginia's youth and how your office has engaged communities. And then Walter and Christine, I'm going to turn back over to you as well to talk about our children after Secretary Moran. Secretary?
Oh, great. Tracy, thanks so much. And just thanks, everyone. I'll second the governor's comments. I mean, this discussion has been so timely. It really will inform the development of our legislative initiatives as we proceed into the special session. So excellent. Juvenile justice, yes. I mean, it has been multiple years, Tracy. We started actually in Governor McAuliffe's administration back in 2014 when we came into office and found out we were spending hundreds of thousands of dollars per resident at our two residential facilities, prison-like facilities, really, Bon Air and Beaumont. And it wasn't so much spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, which would be justified if we were having good results. But 4 out of 5 kids either returned to DJJ or as adults went to DOC. And so it was not working at all. And so transformation began under then Director Andy Block, has continued under the present Director Valerie Boykin. And frankly, I mean, really what it is putting those resources, rather than funding 2 prison-like facilities, funding those resources and putting them into the community-based services, treatment programs. Because if you really dissect and look into what got these kids into, crime, it was some traumatic event, whether physical or mental abuse. And really, where the programming gets to the cause, not just the symptoms, but why is the person abusing substances? Why are they acting out in criminal behavior? So vitally important to get into those treatment programs, and that better community based, so they're back in their community, the access to their loved ones, their families. And so that has been a tremendous success. And of course, Governor Northam has embraced that, put the resources in with our legislative partners. And so we've closed Beaumont, we've decreased intakes, we've certainly decreased the population at Bon Air. And, when taking office in January of 2014, we had about 600 kids at Bon Air and Beaumont combined. We've since closed Beaumont. January of this year, we had just over 200 kids. And I can tell you, as of this week, we're down to 146 kids at Bon Air. And with that size population as well, we can even provide more education. We have the Yvonne Miller Education Center there, more one-on-one attention, and certainly the treatment programs that are vitally important. So these kids aren't, they don't come back to DJJ when we return to the community or end up at DOC. And so that is a tremendous success, but it really is based on, utilizing community-based treatment programs, putting the money back in the community, and treating these kids one-on-one using evidence-based services. And so thanks for the question, and I look forward to the continuing dialogue here. It's been terrific.
Thank you so much for that, Secretary. I think sometimes, it's easy to forget, I think, some of our progress, but I think having that reminder is really important because we have made a lot of progress very quickly. Right? There is so much more that we have to do, but we have made that progress, and so it is worth noting that, so we appreciate that. Walter and Christine, I want to jump back over to you all for a moment. Tiffany Jones has a question for us, and her question is, African-American children in foster care are incarcerated at a much higher rate than Caucasian children and treated for mental illnesses far less. So how can we rectify this? And so, Walter, I'm asking you to perhaps address this and give us your thoughts from a community leader standpoint and the work that you're doing in your community. And then Christine, if you can address this as a healthcare professional.
Okay, I just feel like everybody has to take ownership and accountability, and everybody has to be more active in the community. We have to set up plans and programs in place where if those are the statistics, which they are, that we can be able to have people in positions or resources in positions to help those kids. Because if you help them early, like you all said, before middle school, you help them in elementary school, that middle school area, bridging the gap, more positive things. It'll be more effective as far as us going forward as change. Kids can't choose the situations or circumstances they in. So like they always say, it takes a village. And I truly believe that. It takes the officers, it takes the community, it takes the sheriff, it takes everybody to come together and try to help out in the best way that we possibly can. And that's making sure there's things in place that can help them transition into the real world, into society.
I totally agree,
Go ahead,
Walter.
Christine.
You're absolutely right. And I think with Secretary Moran doing some of the good work, we are on the right path. So thanks to Secretary Moran and his work. In terms of juvenile justice, we've got to take a look at where we're focusing our efforts, right? We've got to shift from incarceration to prevention, early intervention, and rehabilitation. And how do we do that? Through a reallocation of resources. We might not have to spend money on a school resource officer for every school, but I know we need more counselors. We need more ESL teachers to reduce some of that frustration with our linguistically diverse communities. We've got to take a look at how we are funding our community behavioral health centers and where we can maybe shift some of that focus into after-school programs. Like Walter said, it starts in the communities, but it also starts with funding. And where we put our dollars is what we prioritize. So we've always got to be mindful of that budget. We've always got to be mindful of our kids and what their greatest needs are. Their greatest needs are in prevention. And how do we prevent them from traveling down the wrong roads, right? It's through counseling, it's through mentoring, it's through mitigating and retraining the anger management, right? I know Chief Boone has done an awful lot of work with violence interruption. That's a really good program that he's implemented. So those are the things, that's where we need to put our money. But I'd like to circle back just a little bit, because we've got some of the best departments represented here today. But we have to acknowledge that not all localities are created equal. And so although we talk about bringing everybody to the table, Alvin, you hit it right on the head. But I think we need to also examine the power that our police unions hold. I think we need to examine what immunity for police officers actually does to the mindset of someone who might not acknowledge their biases. And I think we need to acknowledge, where we go in terms of the racially diverse communities that we're fostering. Get those kids involved in the police force and bring them into the department, right? If we can pull our kids in, they change the culture within the department. But until we change the culture, we have to acknowledge that we have some deficits around the Commonwealth.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Christine. Each of you all that's joined us this evening has elevated so much, and we certainly appreciate your time. We appreciate your ideas, your recommendations, you kind of pushing back and asking us some of those hard questions back and reminding us about the budget, right? We made so much progress during the 2020 legislative session, and unfortunately, we're now also dealing with the pandemic. Right? And so that has shifted some things, but the budget is certainly something that will be taken up during the special session. So again, appreciate that reminder. As we wrap up our question and answer period, Alvin, I want to come back to you. You're a leadership consultant, you're a relationship expert, you co-host a show on NPR as well. So I want to ask you this question. How do you envision your work in this space bridging the gaps in race relations and relations between community and law enforcement? And how do we continue to get to the heart of the matter?
So that's a wonderful question. And because of the nature of what it is that I get to do professionally, I tend to think of things in terms of analogies, right? So relationships, though they may be seen in different ways, actually maintain very similar principles no matter where they are. And Dr. Underwood and I have this conversation quite often around the uniting principles of these engagements, so to speak. And there's a philosophy or a theory that I refer to called wet grass, right? And what that really is that when you get into an argument, partner, friend, professionally, wherever it may be, there are certain things that you will notice that when the match is struck in the conflict, that conflict with certain people immediately goes up in flames. And in other situations, it seems to fizzle out. And the reason why it fizzles out in certain relationships is because the environment is not such that it could be brought to a flame. What we're working to do through this relationship work, this consistent engagement, is to create wet grass where the community and the police are concerned. And that is to say, when things happen, and they will, because we are humans doing a very difficult job, that it's like striking a match, but you're dropping that match on wet grass. The grass is wet because the relationships are so strong that the conditions are not ripe for a fire. Being proactive in the investment, in the engagement, is the primary way or mechanism by which we provide environments that are healthy and strong so that we do not have these national conversations that suggest that all police are bad or all people of color are criminals or all these absolutes that serve none of us well. So ultimately, the goal is to do the work necessary in order to create the healthy environment and to change the climate and the conditions. And that cannot be done if we are not willing to lean into the discomforts and to be consistent about that. We can't look to check a box. And too often, when we're talking about legislation, too often when we're talking about funding, too often when we're talking about new policies, we are looking to check a box to say, this is what we did. And while all of those things are great, the question is, what are we doing in terms of the consistent effort? What are we investing in on a regular basis that allows for our people to continue to progress in this work that allows us to be better humans one to another, not better police officers, not better people of color, not better law enforcement agents, not better politicians, but how can we be better humans by the way in which we engage one with another? And that is constant work. And it can't be one of those things where we're just happy to be able to say we got the job done. It's the willingness to do the job consistently.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that and for that powerful call to action of doing the work consistently. I want to take a moment to thank you all for your thoughtful and thorough responses. This work isn't easy. We know that it takes each of us pushing from our respective positions to continue moving the conversation forward. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to Paul Taylor. So Paul, I do hope you're on the line with us this evening. Paul and I have been friends for several years now. I am intimately familiar with his efforts, but instead of me sharing his story, I want to turn things over to Paul to share his own story and offer us some next steps in the conversation on racial equity and policing reform. So Paul, are you there?
I don't believe Paul is with us, Tracy. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and talk about those next steps. What we know for sure is that it's not enough to just be not racist. We must actively be anti-racist. We must not be complicit in advancing white supremacy, but we must be all about building those relationships. And as Alvian talked about, building that wet grass and building those conditions so that when a match is striked or strucken, it falls on that wet grass and it fizzles out into steam. And so I just want to thank all of the panelists. We had Ziana Bryant there, a student, an activist. We had faith leaders. We had law enforcement officials. But this is not the last conversation. And so this was a public conversation where anybody could submit a question and we could just have a conversation to get to know each other and start that relationship building. But most importantly, the conversations will continue. And what I'd like to share with everyone is that public safety and homeland security will continue to have these small local conversations where we will bring together the community with local law enforcement agencies, and we will do the very thing that we heard today from Chief Drew and Chief English and others. We heard about bringing people together. Chief DeBoer talked about having a meal with someone and really getting to know people. And Albion talked about at the heart level. So we're going to have a dinner conversation, a series in select localities, and that will build towards our 2021 legislative session reform. Because what we know is that policy building is all about, first, relationship building. And again, I'd just like to underscore all that we heard today. Thank you. It's not about checking a box. It's not about just saying you have a chief diversity officer, the first one in the nation. It's about making sure people are not only at the table, but empowered and expected to be included and also to offer their expertise. We want everyone here to know that we appreciate you. We are clapping for you all. Thank you for your expertise, but thank you, Deputy Secretary Tracy Chazer. Thank you for your expertise. You were a magnificent moderator because you began to figure out what are the themes, and it shows that we have so much more in common than we do that divides us. So thank you for the diverse perspectives. These conversations will continue. And so for that, I am grateful, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Underwood. I have to take a moment to just shout out my colleagues, Dr. Underwood, Alacia, Michaela, in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Secretary Moran, Deputy Secretaries Nikki Zamosny, J.K. Davenport, and Jacqueline as well. We appreciate your collaboration on this effort and us being able to all come together to move this conversation forward. As we conclude, I have 4 asks for you all. My first ask is let's stay connected. If you have not already done so, please visit governor.virginia.gov. And once you're there, I want you to sign up for the governor's press releases and newsletters. This is just one of the ways in which we can stay connected. We have constituency-specific newsletters. We also have regional newsletters. And so please do stay connected to us. The second thing that I want you to do is contact us. Each of us is accessible, and though we do receive a significant amount of correspondence, I cannot underscore that, we will do everything that we can to address your questions and dialogue around joint solutions. The third thing that I want you to do is mark your calendars for August 18th. That's the beginning of our special legislative session and an immediate opportunity to address much of what has been discussed this evening. And then last and certainly not least, Secretary Thomason would be upset with me if I did not mention the importance of the 2020 census. If you have not already done so, please take a moment to check in with your household, get together, and complete that census. There is one form that is required per household, and remember that that is the data that's used by the state, by localities, by the federal government to inform what resources are coming into your community. These resources are resources around healthcare, emergency response. This data helps us inform where schools and hospitals will be built. So please take a moment to complete your 2020 census. If you have already completed it, check in with a neighbor to ensure they've completed it as well. Now, Dr. Underwood calls upon the work and the spirit of John Lewis at the beginning of this conversation, and I want us to end there as well. The late Congressman Lewis once said, if you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have a moral obligation to do something about it. Each of us has a moral obligation. Let's continue to do the work. Thank you and have a good evening.